But he said it doesn't matter. It's very, no, I said it's what?
Disney? Ahora tocamos y nos tomamos. ¿Lo tomamos? Ah. ¿Y cómo se pone? ¿Ya está puesto? Yeah, no, I wanted to do something very, very soon. Hello? Hello? Please take your seats as soon as possible. Why are we in the dark?
Why I in the book?
Okay. Okay. Yes. Buen día a todos y a todas. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third roundtable discussion on addressing the climate crisis in a context of geopolitical conflict. We have some problems with the connection. Okay. We are delighted to be here and very grateful to the organizers, in particular for the warm Colombian welcome that we have received. And I'm very all the more honored to be moderating this roundtable discussion with such distinguished speakers. I will start with Professor Thomas Coutier, Professor Emeritus of International and European Law and Senior Fellow at the World Trade Organization, as well as current arbitrator of the MPIA, followed by EU Ambassador Gilles Bertrand to the Republic of Colombia, Professor of Practice Jennifer Hillman at Georgetown Law Center, and last but certainly not least, Professor Gabriel Marceau, Senior Counselor at the WTO Secretariat and Associate Professor of Law at the University of Geneva. So the topic of our roundtable discussion today, addressing the climate crisis in a context of geopolitical conflict, is, unlike perhaps previous roundtable discussions we had, certainly not new. The international community, as you know, has been trying to address the climate change for over 20 years now, since the adoption of the UN FCC. And yet, I don't think we have seen such a degree of attention to climate change and the climate crisis among international economic lawyers as we are seeing today. I think this is evident from the program of our conference. I don't think I have been at a session in our conference where climate change didn't come up for one reason or another. But also, as Gabrielle was telling us, even in discussions in the WTO, climate change seems to be everywhere nowadays, in every corridor, in every committee. And I think there are three main reasons for that. And it's on the broad themes on which our speakers will be giving some thoughts. The first is, I think, what I will call the reality of the problem, is the fact that climate change is happening and its adverse effects are being felt in all the regions of the world, even though not in an even manner. So we're no longer talking about the threat of climate change, as you were saying, Jennifer, but the reality of climate change and indeed the climate crisis. The second reason, I think, has to do with the nature of the response, how countries around the world are responding or trying to address the climate crisis, and the fact that an increasing number of countries, not only in the global north, but also in the global south, are using trade-related measures, from subsidies to market access measures, to address the climate crisis, which pushes us, as international economic lawyers and trade lawyers, to rethink current WTO rules and whether they are appropriate to manage these regulatory responses. And the third reason is the context, the current context of geopolitical conflict, which of course is making international cooperation on fighting climate change all the more challenging and difficult, like in other areas, cooperation in other areas of international relations, but it also raising questions, as we saw from the roundtable discussion yesterday, as to whether we should be viewing climate change as a security, so through the prism of national security. And I know there are different views around the table and in the room on that. So on these broad themes, our speakers will be providing some critical insights, some critical views. Unfortunately, we lost our main voice from the Global South, Santiago Vils, who couldn't join us due to work commitments in Geneva. And so what I want to do, one of my main objectives as chair, is to make sure that we have at least 15 or 20 minutes for a question and answer session with the audience. And I'm in particular inviting those voices from the Global South in the audience to please think about challenging questions for our distinguished speakers. So without taking more of my time as moderator, I will now turn to Professor Thomas Gauthier, who has very kindly agreed to start off the discussion by offering some general global perspective on our topic. So how do you think our current geopolitical context is affecting the global response to the climate crisis?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcia. I think the geopolitical tensions have resonated in all the two previous roundtables and in many of the panels. And of course, we all know that geopolitics also loom large in the background of international economic law. Mostly people assume that they know what the tension is, but I'm trying to speak out and say, I guess it's about the United States defending hegemony. It's about China challenging the hegemony, and it's about Russia claiming a lost empire. And all the rest of the world is caught in between somehow in a very messy situation here. In the longer run, I think these conflicts will open up new dividing lines. And as a lawyer, I think it's interesting for me to think that these dividing lines are essentially in the law. I consider the rule of law to be a fundamental dividing line, separation of powers, and freedom of expression. Of course, the world is very messy, and it's very difficult to distinguish between, ever since the old Greeks, between democracy and autocracy. But I think these dividing lines will eventually translate also into our own field. And that is, of course, a great challenge, because international economic law is essentially colorblind. We don't ask for a particular political system to be adhered to become a member of the WTO or to any other of these international universal organizations here. But eventually, as these political systems are being threatened, they respond back by using trade measures. And that, of course, is not new. I just recall Lowenfeld's book about trade controls for political end, published in 1983. So this is not new, and we have to live with this in many of the subjects we were discussing, including what you just mentioned about national security relates to that. But I think if we go all down the line, we probably will end up in new trade blocs of like-minded countries along the lines of the divide in a very messy situation here. And of course, this will, in terms of international law, boil down that relations among different political systems will boil down to the law of coexistence, the classical international law, perhaps also even warfare under the Geneva Conventions here, while cooperation will be limited to like-minded countries. And that will leave us in the end to a new generation of trade blocs. That's the raw picture, and that is, of course, very, very bad news for climate change policies, because climate change policies inherently depend on close international cooperation. We simply cannot solve the problem without international cooperation among also non-like-minded countries. We need cooperation even between governments who may be rivalries in other areas here. We have climate change mitigation. In the end of the day, it boils down to adopt a common carbon price, or at least methodologies to define carbon pricing here. It's very difficult to do without this here. And that entails cooperation of all the major polluting countries. We have climate change adaptation, which hasn't been talked about much in this conference so far, but which probably is at the center for most countries. It affects nutrition and it affects migration, a topic we haven't even talked in the WTO context beyond Mode 4 and labor mobility here. But if we're not able to control climate change, we will see massive migration, not only within countries, but also across boundaries. And that will, I don't need to stress that, greatly put a lot of governments at risk here and add to the turmoil. We also have climate change communication. We cannot succeed in climate change if there is not sufficient awareness. And in many countries around the world, there is not sufficient awareness of this because there is no freedom of information. And so this is another point where we need to stress our cooperation. Now, how can we do this? How can we bridge the divide between the law of coexistence in power politics and all these areas, and the need for close cooperation. And my suggestion would be here to you that we use the principle of common concern of humankind. The common concern of humankind was recognized in the preambles of the UNFCCC and in the Paris Accord. It's also recognized in the Biodiversity Convention and some others here. But we as lawyers haven't done much out of this so far. It stands there in the preambles, but we have not operationalized this in terms of an obligation to cooperate, in an obligation to do our homework, and also in disciplines on compliance here. And I would urge the community of international economic lawyers and the WTO lawyers to explore the potential of this principle as we apply it to bring about greater cooperation in the field where cooperation is absolutely necessary if we want to succeed, despite all the realities of geopolitics, as I tried to describe them very briefly.
Thank you very much, Professor Cotier, for those general remarks. I will now turn to Ambassador Gilles Bertrand for you to follow up with a new perspective on our topic, and in particular, similar question, how do you think the current geopolitical context is shaping the EU response to the climate crisis, not only in relation to your cooperation with Colombia, which obviously you know very well in Latin America, but more broadly?
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation in such a space for reflection among distinguished economic lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, so you will have to excuse me if I say things that do not sound entirely academic on a few things, but I can try to bring in a bit of a well, practitioner's view, so to speak. But I think to start with, we had a very clear example last year of a potential conflict between our green agenda and geopolitical realities in the shape of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there were quite a few people in the EU who were like, sort of quietly thinking, so the Green Pact and the Green Deal, etc., are going to be sort of put on the back burner for a while. And they were quite disappointed because in the end, if you look back to the last year and a half, if you look back to the speed at which we, well, detoxed from Russian oil and gas, when you look back to the way we've accelerated in many ways some of the transitions that we were working on, I think so far we've managed to actually show that not only the Russian invasion of Ukraine was not going to delay the agenda, but in fact possibly it was going to accelerate it. And we did it because we just feel that time is running out. Time is running out to fix the mess that has been created on our planet. And that's, there was no way we could just sort of suspend many of the processes we had started just because geopolitical realities were coming to us. We are also aware, and I think that's a factor many of the countries on the planet are aware of, but not all, that the later and the slower the action, well, the costlier and the harder it will be. So it's really a question of the faster you act, the better placed you are in a way to avoid the worst effects. And I think I think Professor Cotier was right when he said that the first thing you need for climate change and for tackling climate change is a very strong international cooperation. There's no way you can actually do anything on implementing the Paris Agreement, the rather ambitious Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, if you're not cooperating internationally. And that element is actually something where we have to be very clear. That also means that even when you may have other countries or other blocs that do not share very fundamental values, if there is a convergence on that element of combating climate change together, this in itself is essential, and this in itself requires to continue cooperation, at least on that particular point, and give it a certain element of priority, because we all depend on it. For the rest, what we feel is that we need to convince as many countries as we can of the need to change deeply the way international finance works, to scale up finance for forests and biodiversity, to work on green taxonomy, to be able basically to build a greener financial environment for the planet. That also is something that you cannot do just on your own, but we feel that if the EU and a number of other like-minded countries, and as I said, countries that may not share many of our ideas on how to run our political systems, that may share that objective of tackling climate change, agree on this, then we feel that we can actually make quite a lot of progress. We believe in promoting sustainable value chains. You probably know this is something on which we talk a lot in this country, the regulation on deforestation, where we are trying to basically get a guarantee that the products that are, at least on 6 products to start with, that they are not produced on deforested land, or at least land that was deforested after 2021. This is an example also of how you can use your market to make sure that at least your consumers get a guarantee that they are not consuming products that are the result of a continued degradation of the environment. And we feel also that we need to protect as much space as possible for international cooperation on research and innovation. And that there again, if we can have a multifaceted engagement with all partner countries that are ready to work on this, to work or to basically promote scientific cooperation, whether it's on forests, on biodiversity, on circular economy, on well, this is actually something that has to be done. That's one of the reasons, for instance, why we have run a rather open approach to our Copernicus program, our system of Earth observation, where we consider that all the partners that can actually benefit from the work of Copernicus to advance their green agendas should be able to do so without obstacles. And just to sort of conclude these very first remarks, I think precisely the relationship between the EU and Colombia is a good example of how well it works when you share the same values, you share the same level of priority on climate change, on particularly the fight against the loss of biodiversity. But when you look over the last years, say, comparing with 5 years ago, Colombia has become a very close partner of the EU at the world level, at the regional level, and also at the national level. At the world level, in particular, on the whole issue of biodiversity. I mean, this country is a giant in biodiversity, and we've worked very closely, for instance, on the work we achieved in Montreal last year between the EU and Colombia. Regionally, in particular, on the preservation of the Amazon, because of course we talk about all the systemic issues, but you also have. What was that? Yeah, sorry. You also have a couple of wild cards on the planet, and for instance, if you lose the Amazon, you're just losing the world's climate, and you might have done everything right on all the rest, but this will not be enough. And on the Amazon, starting from the Leticia Pact, continuing with what was going on last weekend, Leticia as well, the pre-Amazon Summit meeting that Brazil and Colombia organized. There's a very strong cooperation there also with the EU. And nationally, whether you look at the support to the adaptation of the Colombian economy, you look at how we are trying to encourage relations between green, the spreading of green innovation between our research communities, cooperation between not just large companies, but also small and medium enterprises, on green innovation, you actually realize that there is a whole ecosystem there that works extremely well and has improved. I've been the EU ambassador in this country for 2 years. I've already welcomed twice the Environment Commissioner. The last visit was this weekend for the summit in Laetitia, and once the Vice President of the Commission for Climate Change. It just gives you an example of the intensity of contacts, and that goes without mentioning all the contacts ahead of the various COPs, during the COPs, during all the meetings that take place. Compare it with 5 or 10 years ago, and this is incomparable. And that's an example of what can be done when the like-mindedness is there. And I believe that actually the more we manage to build alliances like the one we have between the EU and Colombia, the more we can actually act, as I said, fast enough and boldly enough so that it's actually less costly and less dangerous for the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Perhaps I will follow up quickly with a question to both of you to offer some additional reflections on your intervention. I think you both highlighted the fact that climate change should be seen as a matter of common concern, and I think there will be no disagreement on that, no disagreement among reasonable people at least, and that the answer is cooperation, and you both emphasize that a lot in your initial interventions, and cooperation not between only like-minded states, but also between like-minded and not like-minded states. Yet, Ambassador Bertrand, there's been a lot of cooperation in the EU response to the climate crisis, but there's been not only cooperation, there's also been a clear assertive move by the EU to go unilaterally in its response. I mean, you referred to the deforestation regulation, but there are other measures as well that the EU has adopted as part of the Green Deal that are unilateral in tenure. I'm wondering how you see that unilateral response by the EU and the effects that it can have on whether it risks putting at risk that cooperation that is needed, not only between like-minded states, as you are emphasizing, but between also with not like-minded states, as Professor Coetzee was. So are we risking ended up in what he was referring as a messy situation where you only have cooperation between like-minded states, but at the end of the day, that's not enough to protect the global climate?
Yeah, I would adopt cooperation in very broad terms, you know, and it isn't something where you only move if you agree on each and every stage. We know in trade policy that unilateral measures are very important to move an agenda forward here, and it's not different in the area of the environment and climate change. And we've seen the effect of unilateral measures adopted by the EU now actually waking up the international trade community to face the challenges which they dodged so far. So I think we need a philosophy of carrot and sticks, and under a broad umbrella of cooperation.
I think the whole logic of I mean, as long as you are one of the largest markets on the planet, if you don't take action and if you leave space for things to go on as usual, they go on as usual. So what led us to that idea that we should actually start acting unilaterally on some very specific elements is exactly that. You have to use the weight of the EU market to accelerate the changes in a way I'm saying in Professor Coetzee was just saying. But when we do it, we are aware that this comes with adaptation costs, and this comes with, and just to give the example of the deforestation regulation, this is something on which we've been working now for more than 2 years with Colombian partners, with the gremios, the professional organizations of the producers of the products concerned by this first batch of the regulation to adapt. And what we keep saying, and what is really our line here in particular is of course, we don't want the regulation to have a negative impact, neither on the volume nor on the quality of trade. We actually want a positive impact. We want more products that you can consider organic, deforestation free, etc. And we actually want these products, I mean, we wanted a quantitative increase in these products. It's not a question also of protecting our markets, because most of these products we don't produce. So, you know, you're talking about things, commodities that we need in the EU, where our consumers want to be certain that they are not consuming products that are the consequence of unsustainable practices. But the logic is actually to work with the producers to make sure that they will actually even turn that into a success. And I will go even farther. We want this to be a success, particularly here, because we need to be able to go to countries that are less convinced than Colombia about the fight against climate change, and to show them that EU-Colombia trade has actually benefited from that first mover effect, and that their producers should actually adapt. That's one example, but this is really the approach that we try to have. And I think it's a way of exerting our responsibility, but still being aware of the cost of change and of the need to accompany the change to avoid situations where you're actually, I mean, that would actually backfire against what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you very much. I will have quite a few follow-up questions on both of your interventions, but I'm sure there will be more coming from the audience. In the benefit of time, I'm going to turn now to Professor Jennifer Hillman, who's going to offer some critical perspective from the US on its response to the climate crisis in recent years, and in particular, the Inflation Reduction Act to begin with.
Great, thank you. And it's really a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank the SEAL organizers and everyone for including me. I wanted to just touch a little bit on what the United States has done in this climate change space, and then give you some thoughts or my takeaways on what to make of that. I think if you step back and look at it, for the last 20 years, the US approach to fighting climate change has been, until very recently, largely based on regulation. Regulating the amount of emissions, and that cuts across the entire swath of the US economy. As a result, if you look at it, US greenhouse gas emissions have fallen by 20% since 2005. So I mean, these regulations are having a bite in terms of pushing companies to reduce their emissions. But it's pretty clear that the Biden administration and the Congress realized this was not enough. I mean, that we were simply not going to get there by regulation alone. And so a major pivot happened, a year and a half ago when the Biden administration came in to put the United States heavily on the road of industrial policy and massive new subsidies. So 3 major funding bills. For those of you that were at the first panel discussion yesterday, you heard Amy Porges touch on these. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the so-called CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Collectively, these 3 bills mean that the federal government in the United States will literally triple the amount of spending that it's devoting to climate change and clean energy in this decade compared to where we were in the 2010s. This likely means a reduction by 50% of the total amount of greenhouse gases emitted in the United States if you look at what is expected by 2030 as compared to where we were in 2005. It also means that the United States is likely to become a major global manufacturer of green-related products and materials. So again, some major implications. Of these, the biggest of the acts was clearly the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's also the one that's raised the most controversy in the geopolitical context. This bill provides literally hundreds of billions of dollars in clean energy incentives, loans, tax credits, and direct payments. More than 60 individual provisions spread throughout this bill that go directly to the issues of climate and green energy. But it's raised the hackles of many of our trading partners. And I think for 2 major reasons. One is just the sheer size and the magnitude of this bill. I mean, in theory, if you think about what those grants, those loans, those tax credits do, at some level, they also unleash the power of the private sector. So this bill is expected to have not just billions, but $1 trillion or trillions of dollar impact in the US economy, which has then caused everybody else in the world to say, hey, wait a minute here. The sheer size of those numbers means you are drawing in investments into the United States, where everybody is going to start making their electric vehicles, their clean energy in the United States rather than at home. And that presents competitive issues for a lot of other countries. But secondly, are the specific provisions within the bill, for example, related to electric vehicles. You get a $7,500 tax credit to buy an electric vehicle if the electric vehicle was assembled in North America, and if a certain portion, 40% of the critical minerals and 50% of the components in the battery that goes into the electric vehicle, and let's be honest, the battery is the key component, have to be made in the United States or in a country with which the United States has a free trade agreement. All right. A lot of those last provisions were obviously pushed at trying to reduce reliance on China, which has 61% of the world's lithium and 90% of the electrode, the battery making components is all done in China. But, the United States didn't, as Vera really clearly pointed out, they didn't do the math. They did not do the math before this bill passed. So all of a sudden, oops, we look around and say, can we actually meet these requirements that 40% of the components be made in the United States, that so much percentage of the critical minerals be coming from the United States or a free trade agreement partner? No, we can't meet those. So all of a sudden you started this effort to find workarounds. So we negotiated a critical minerals agreement with Japan. We're now in the process of negotiating a critical minerals agreement with the European Union. We decided to declare that if a car is leased as opposed to purchased outright, and leasing cars is a very common practice in the United States, it doesn't count for the assembled in North America requirements. So foreign electric vehicles can come in as long as they are leased but not sold to American consumers. So a whole lot of workarounds, in this IRA. The second, kind of completely different initiative that the United States has then started in the climate change area is the negotiation of the Global Arrangement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminum, sometimes referred to by the very nasty acronym of GASA or GASA in the United States. It's being negotiated between the European Union and the United States. Again, makes sense. Steel and aluminum are, themselves very large greenhouse gas emitters. 8% of all GHGs come from steel producing, 4% from aluminum. So if you could rein in those two alone, you're really doing something serious about more than 12% of total global greenhouse gas emission. The idea behind it is that the EU and the US are both going to impose a tariff on steel and aluminum imports from any country that is not a member of this club. And in order to get into the club, you have to do three things. You have to produce steel and aluminum at emissions standards levels that have been agreed upon as part of this deal. Secondly, you have to commit not to overproduce steel and aluminum. And thirdly, you have to limit the activity of state-owned enterprises. Again, obviously a dig or a direction at China to try to make sure that China would be kept out of this arrangement. So where does this stand? There's a lot of work going on right now. My understanding is it's getting pretty bogged down in debates over how do we measure these emissions and what is exactly the standard that's going to be set. But, again, underlying it are, I think, problems with the competing goals by which the US and the EU came into this. For the United States, the major goal was to get the European Union on board fighting China. For the European Union, the major goal was to get out from under the 232, the national security tariffs that have been imposed on steel and aluminum. So when I step back from that and say, okay, what is my kind of takeaway of this sort of new approach of the United States to go down this industrial policy subsidy road? I mean, what should we make of this? For me, three key takeaways to sort of think about in this room. The first for me is how noticeable it was that during the debate on the Inflation Reduction Act, which clearly had unequivocal local content requirements in it, nobody said, oops, what about our WTO obligations? Just what about that? It used to be, and maybe I'm dating myself, when I was the general counsel at USTR, it used to be that USTR officials, State Department officials, Justice Department officials would at least say, hey, whoa, hold on here. Let's think about whether we need to be doing this in a way that is so clearly violating our WTO obligations. But, you know, it's very clear that that is a significantly lesser concern in the United States today, particularly when it comes to climate change and national security measures. And that fact alone, the US doesn't really care whether it's violating the WTO, to me is something that should be of substantial concern. The second, for me, major takeaway is that the United States in all of these initiatives has mixed up the goal. It says the goal is climate change, climate change, climate change, but also, and the alsos are always about the two driving agendas in the United States right now. The number one driving agenda in the United States is pushing back on China. The number two agenda in the United States is creating jobs and creating a technology advantage for the United States. And so all of these measures are combining those two goals. And to me, again, that's very problematic. A, it undermines the effectiveness for climate change purposes if you're going to mix in all of these other goals. And the undermining is most clear when you think about the pushback on China, because it's really clear we cannot solve the climate change problem without China. China is by far, far, far the largest producer of solar cells, of solar modules, of wind turbines, of all that goes into producing hydropower, and of all of the technology connected to electric vehicles and batteries. All of it is heavily, heavily produced in China. So on the one hand, we can't move ahead with a green agenda without China. And on the other hand, China just finished building 260 coal-fired power plants around the world under the auspices of its Belt and Road Initiative. It still continues to be the largest emitter and user of coal-fired power. Those plants are going to be operational for 35 to 50 years. We cannot solve the problem without bringing on board China and the whole issue of the increase, not decrease, the increased use of coal-fired power. Third and last sort of takeaway from me is how much this presages the conflict between those that are taking the US approach of subsidies plus, industrial policy compared to or contrasted to those that are taking a price-based CBAM approach to fighting climate change. So, again, a lot of kind of conflicts, whatever, anyway, out there in terms of what the US has done.
Thank you very much for these very thought-provoking reflections, Professor Hellman. There is one point on which I wanted to prompt you a little bit further, if I may, but only for another 2 minutes. In addition to everything that you have said, which I largely agree with, it is also true that the US is one of the countries that is increasingly viewing, or at least claiming to view, climate change as a national security issue. And I wanted you to share your thoughts of whether you think the US can and should do that, including in light of its WTO obligations, even though they don't seem to be taking them into account very much.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Let me just start with the can it. And again, this would take a lot longer analysis, but in my view, the answer is maybe. And again, I think there's 3 ways to think about how you could do that. If you think about it, it would have to be under Article 21 of the GATT. To me, 3 possibilities. One is you fit it under the provision that talks about arms, ammunition, implements of war, directly or indirectly relating to the supply of a military institution, because there's tons and tons of data out there about how all of our the number of military ports around the world that are going to be underwater and therefore not usable, the amount of military equipment that cannot operate above X degrees of temperature, and we're now going to have major parts of the world be above X, on and on. So you can at least make an argument that you're going to have to do a huge amount of reconfiguring, readapting, resupplying, reconfiguring all of your military establishments. So you might make an argument you could fit under that. Secondly, taken in a time of war or other international emergency, again, there may be ways to think about, could you fit this under there? Again, you think about what is going to happen in terms of emergencies in international relations. Just take the migration issue alone that Thomas mentioned. Most of the studies are indicating that by 2050, we will have somewhere between 200 million and 250 million climate migrants who must move, either because the place that they live is underwater or the place that they live is too hot to be habitable. 250 million people by 2050. The movement of all of those people alone is enough to say this is an emergency in international relations. Just that alone, leave aside all the wars that are going to be coming over access to water. Who gets the Mekong River when China uses it all for its own hydropower? et cetera, et cetera. So you could make an argument there. And thirdly, you could maybe fit this under the last part of Article 21, which is a UN Security Council resolution that declares climate change to be a risk, a national security risk, in which point you fit under that 21C that says that members can take measures as long as they are doing it in pursuit of a UN Security Council, well, a UN obligation for international peace and security. So can it, you know, again, does it fit neatly? No, but could it? You can imagine any one of these three scenarios being at least grounds to say yes. Should it? That's a much, much harder question. Because if you look at 21, it doesn't have the chapeau that 20 does. So once you say yes, climate change fits under 21, there aren't the same kind of guardrails to make sure that you're staying, you know, within some basic framework of whether it was really necessary to do this kind of discrimination. You don't have those guardrails. And it risks lots of other problems with countries that don't agree that it should be declared a national security risk. So now you've got a lot of discord where other people think that climate change should stay in the environment realm and shouldn't be bleeding over it. And once you move into national security, now you're giving carte blanche to militaries to invade other places over security reasons, et cetera. So to me, it raises a huge number of risks to go down this road. And on the other end, my view is it's coming. I will read you just one sentence of what President Biden said at a UN, again, meeting. The climate crisis is about human security, economic security, environmental security, national security, and the very life of the planet. Everyone is starting to talk about it as national security. So I think it is one of those things that we really need to at least think about, worry about, where are the guardrails if we're going to put climate change into the national security realm.
Thank you very much, Professor Hillman. Again, I agree with most of your reflections, and I'm sure there will be a lot of reactions on them from the audience. But before we get there, last but certainly not least, Professor Gabrielle Marceau, who's going to offer some reflections from a WTO perspective, and in particular, what you think are the key issues or challenges for the WTO in trying to manage these messy responses that we are seeing to the climate crisis from various countries. We heard about the European Union, also the US, but certainly as well many others. So what do you think are the key issues or key challenges for the WTO in managing all this?
Thank you very much, Ciel, for including me, and Gracia for the questions. Yes, I agree fully with the last comments of Jennifer. And I will, in a way, sort of confirm. Well, I would say that one of the biggest challenge is not the legal compatibility, although I'm a lawyer, and I will cite two principles invoked by the appellate, but in past cases that would be helpful. I would say that the biggest issue is to make sure that it does not become a north-south issue, and it cannot be, and it's not, but also the call for comparison that is necessary if there is invocation of Article 20 that justify actions, arguably extraterritorial actions on climate change. And my question, my comment is, we know the case law on comparison. So if I take the old asbestos case, the appellate body has said, for instance, that whether you deal with Article 3.2 or 3.4 dealing with non-discrimination on tax or non-discrimination on regulation, both provisions should have relatively the same scope. Otherwise, government, if you're looser on tax, will put everything in regulations and vice versa. So that's the last point, one of the last points made by Jennifer. Some governments equal state. It's a fundamental principle of law. States are equal. Some governments will follow regulation type approach, other non-price type approach. The other part of this test came, we have repeated it many times, from shrimp, where US lose the first time because it requires that the exporting country use their method, use their net. They changed the law and they will win. Why? because they put in place a requirement that the exporting country uses rather a program of comparative effectiveness. And let me reread this paragraph that I read about 100 times to try to understand where it could take us. Such standard or requirements, comparable environmental effectiveness, would allow the exporting member to adopt a regulatory program that is suitable to the specific conditions prevailing in its territory. So, in my view, this is going to be one of the huge challenges of the WTO, and this is not a legal issue or not even a trade issue. It's an environment issue. Effectiveness. And this brings me to another aspects of this difficult comparison. And if I talk about CBAM, it's just as an example, because CBAM is a price-based measure, but you compare what and effectiveness to what. So the case law has said you look at the goal of the measure, in the case of shrimp protecting turtles, and you look at whether the exporting country does something that will have the same effect. So big question, big challenge. This CBAM, for instance, is the goal to deal with climate change, to reduce emission, or to avoid leakage? Because the broader the goal, the broader the comparison, the more difficult. So if the EU is clear, I want to avoid leakage, let's say in the steel industry. 12 years ago, the US put forward informally proposals for domestically a tax on steel. And I remember doing a note at the time saying the biggest challenge will be, what will the US answer to Brazil if they export to Brazil and they challenge the tax? And they say, I plant green trees in Brazil, even above all my commitment. I used to think, well, we'll have to deal with the effect of those planting trees and tax on, let's say, steel in the US. I think it was wrong. If the goal is to avoid leakage, even if Brazil plant trees, it may be very good for the environment, will it avoid leakage in steel? But there are other things in this comparison. Now I was talking about the effectiveness. The comparison, we talked about it yesterday, and there was a Colombian lawyer. I looked for her, I don't see her. I thought what she said was so wise, Maria Paula Sanchez, where in the context of comparison and price and non-price, she raised these new sort of proposal about implicit price. Explicit and implicit price together would lead to the effective price. I wonder whether the EU with its effective price got the idea from the effectiveness of shrimp. But for instance, she mentioned, and I would support that, but it's going to become extremely technically complicated for the WTO to deal with this environmental question. She said there are many fiscal measures that are in place, the goal of which is to reduce leakage, to increase costs in the country, Colombia, discouraging the movement of companies from whatever US and EU to Colombia, because there will be costs here as well. Maybe not exactly the cost relating to directly limiting the emission, but maybe indirectly. And there are a long list, more and more, of this implicit and explicit sort of costs imposed in the context of fossil fuel, etc. Let me just conclude, and I will have more to say. I would have more to say. This is just one small bit, because we're all a bit legal technician. Comparison is the job of the WTO. It's a club. And the club is that you treat equally all countries that are in the club. The WTO is rarely a North-South forum country to some UN. But, and this may be coming later on, when the appellate body said, suitable to the specific conditions prevailing in its territory. What? And of course, the appellate body is not there anymore, but I praise the principle. It is important that countries collaborate and discuss, and it cannot be done only at the WTO. The World Steel Association, about 2-3 months ago, asked the DG of the WTO to deal with climate change. And they said, because you're the forum that developing countries love most, because it's consensus and their right to vote and all that is equal. All states are equal. Maybe, but in my view, this is one of the biggest challenge, dealing with these technically environmental difficult issue of comparison.
Thank you very much for those initial remarks, Professor Marceau. Very quickly, I mean, you've put a lot of emphasis on comparison equivalence as the main challenge for the WTO, and in particular, how to put it into practice, what to compare and how, because these are largely environmental questions, as you say, rather than trade questions. But one additional challenge, I think, that comes from the environmental regime is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. I mean, in the WTO, comparisons and equivalence are all about ensuring, as you say, that all members make equivalent efforts or comparable efforts in effectiveness. Whereas in the climate change regime, you will take the opposite position, that members should make differentiated efforts, not efforts that are equivalent or comparable in any way in fighting climate change. So if you can very briefly share your views on whether you think that principle has any relevance for the WTO and the discussions that are happening in the WTO, or is that totally irrelevant in your view? And or helpful?
I'm not sure I agree with you that in the WTO, the comparison, and I'm talking about comparison under Article 20. When you compare under national treatment, MFN and all that, you compare like products. Under 20, you compare situations, not like products. And in my view, situation, that's why I repeat it, in light of the specific conditions prevailing in the exporting country, in my view, require a flexibility that will take into account the conditions, not of each country. That's what Malaysia tried in shrimp, but globally. Now, the CBDR principle is a principle of environmental law. I did quite some research recently to try to clarify my point. It used to be at the beginning, and from Rio to Kyoto and all that, a clear differentiation sort of principle. And it was always in the context of agreement that included linking clause, where the commitments of developing countries were clearly made, I would say, almost conditional to rich countries doing their part. In my view, this has changed with the Paris Agreement, where the linking sort of clause disappeared. Why? Because the choice was that each country will make commitments at the level they can support, a bit like in WTO trade facilitation or even services. And in fact, the linking clause is not there anymore. There's only, let me read it, this reference to different national circumstances where it's written, rich countries should go ahead and do most efforts or many efforts, but developing countries should continue enhancing their efforts and are encouraged to move over time towards economy-wise emission in light of different national circumstances. In my view, this brings CBDR in light and or even parallel to the chapeau of Article 20 that says that you should look at this discrimination or non-discrimination or justification between countries where the same conditions prevail. And I think that the EU has never denied, for instance, in CBAM or other, that countries have different capacities, different problems. But this is part of the challenge, how to make sure that the countries that deal and go ahead, because in WTO, unilateral measures are legal. And countries have the right to want to avoid leakage. But at the same time, the right of other countries that have less capacity and less means, etc. So I do think that this principle, I'm not too sure what it means exactly. That's the big challenge, but it is relevant. And that's going to be my last comment. When you look at these Article 20 situation, you're supposed to look at, are there alternatives that would do the same trick? Well, alternative is an environment question. We're going to need a lot of environment sort of expert, but also comparable effectiveness. This is an environmental question again. Whether it's CBDR or the chapeau of Article 20 or the principle that Thomas mentioned, it's all about trying to find the sort of balance that we all need. And it's not a north-south balance, at least not only.
I will agree with that. Very, very briefly, because I want to open to questions from the audience. It's already 5 to 12, although we started 15 minutes late. So can we take a bit more time before the lunch break?
Yes.
Please, the boss.
I think,
Marcus, sorry, I was looking for you.
yeah, I think it's fascinating to assess the interpretation issues in existing law, but I'd like to draw the attention that the agenda is much wider. And I think we are witnessing now a paradigm shift. And the paradigm shift is that we see fundamental changes in non-discrimination moving from the physical properties to the production and process methods. This is inherent to the principle of sustainability, and it will translate in all the areas. And in my view, the big challenge here we have to face in reviewing all these different agreements on mitigation, for example, which is essentially an energy transition effort, TRIPS, SCM, TBT, GATS, GPA, a lot of agreements are affected. How do we manage this transition in this paradigm shift? And the key to this, to make it just legitimate, the use of PPMs is the dissemination of technology. Because you can only ask people to produce in certain ways if the technology is made available to change the production methods here. And the beauty of climate change is that never before in mankind did we have a situation that we have all a shared interest to make the best technology and the best practices in place wherever this is on the globe, because we have an immediate benefit. It doesn't matter whether a battery is produced in China or in Colombia. If it's done in a clean way, we all benefit. And that's a new equation. And I think we should really build upon this. And my bet is to all of you in the room that we have to revise, we have to review all these agreements in the WHO to see whether they actually respond to these new requirements. And of course, we will continue to have litigation on existing agreements, very complicated issues, etc. But we must not lose the sight. And I think that's particularly the role of academics, who really have to make the effort to think through and start making proposals in which way we might go, so that the trading community in Geneva can take it up in negotiations. They will not do this work on their own. This has to be fed in, and that's one of the critical contributions to society and their members can make.
Thank you very much, Professor Coutier. So now I open to questions from the audience. I see a lot of hands already. Should we take 4? So Lauren, did you have your hand up? Here, there, and over there, and yeah, 4, and Geraldo 5. So let's take 5 to start with, and then let's see if we can take another round. Should I do it or you do it? ¿Lo haces tú? Sí. ¿Ellos? No, señora, no.
So I've got a question for Gabrielle and to some extent Jennifer. So one point that you made was that regulatory measures and fiscal measures should more or less have the same scope. And it seems to me that there's a similarity between local content requirements and the idea of preventing carbon leakage. And I was a bit struck when Gabrielle said that preventing carbon leakage can be a legitimate policy objective, because that sounds to me like a very industrial policy, which doesn't have anything to do with the environment. So I'm not, well, I'd like to know what your views are. How on earth can you just say that avoiding carbon leakage is actually at all a legitimate policy objective?
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. Professor Kuti made the point that adaptation is a critical issue that we need to be, putting front and center, which I think in many respects is the key issue for most developing countries. But I didn't hear the panel talk anything a bit about the just transition process and how we're going to finance this. Of course, the big players are juggling for geopolitical and geoeconomic gains. Increasingly, you're going to see greater block formation. And then, so the issues of financing and technology transfer and all of those things are going to be colored by those objectives. So I just wanted to invite the panel to maybe respond to that as an element of thing. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Geraldo, and her as well. Then over there, Vera, yeah, Geraldo.
Good morning to Gabriella or Jennifer. Look, at the old times, I studied physics. And the first thing you learn when you arrive in the physics laboratory is to get the same result, you have to have the same pressure and temperature conditions. What we are having here now, a discussion about law and principles. And my point is on the basis. That is, if you go to the global map, the Mapa Mundi, what you learn is that the majority, 3/4 of countries are above the equator. Look, the equator passed through here, Bolivia and Brazil and Indonesia. The rest is above. So the conditions of pressure and temperature are different. So the way you measure all the points that you need to know about environment are different. While, again, in tropical countries, we need to have a lot of pesticides and fertilizers and so on, if not because the insects is going to eat everything. It's different. It's different to raise a chicken in the north and the chicken in Brazil, a cow there. So the methane the cow emits is different because they are under the same place. The question is how you lawyers are going to solve this issue. The things you measure are not the same. My ton of steel is different from for the north and Gabriel, sorry, the Carbon Club agreed not to agree. Last week, so the United States is measuring the emission of steel in the different from the European Union, and they decide not to discuss anymore because they cannot agree. So how I am the basis of the discussion of climate. How about how the lawyers are going to solve this? And a question, sorry. How are you going to save about the deforestation? How you are going to explain to the world the fire in Canada? Tell me. Gabriel, tell me what is this spontaneous fire and what is a fire made by man? Come on.
Thank you. So I think my question goes to Geraldo Vidigal from the University of Amsterdam. I'm originally from the Global South, so hopefully also filling that gap. So I think it goes in the same direction as the two previous speakers. So, but I'd like to ask more about exactly. So the lawyer, are lawyers going to solve this? And if they're not, then who is? So what institutions are we going to bring in to make these calculations and engage in these negotiations? I understand that the WTO, I mean, apparently, developing countries like the WTO as a forum, but for example, India has already said that it doesn't want anything about environmental regulations in the WTO, which I understand is a mistake because it's a wrong assumption that by not having rules somehow things are not allowed, but when maybe the opposite is the truth. But and then I mean, and maybe from the diplomats and the others. So what is the form we're looking at for this here? Is it the OECD? Is there anyone who is engaging in this comparability exercise, also taking into account common but differentiated responsibilities? Because I mean, the alternative to this is I mean, a bad scenario in which a retired diplomat from Uruguay, Singaporean lawyer, and probably Professor Cotier have to make a call on, you know, is this sufficiently taking into account a CBDR or not? And so is this, so what is the, I mean, what is the status here? Is it the, as Professor Dawson just said, a situation where we'll all go it alone and eventually try to make something work out, or is there someone working on this situation in a way that also contemplate the willing but maybe not so able countries that want to cooperate but also want to feel that the EU and the US are not just exporting the burden of compliance cost of paying for climate change mitigation? Thank you.
Yes, very short. Thank you very much for your presentations. Gustavo Guarín from the Colombian WTO delegation, and also professor here in the Senado. So my question is less abstract and more practical, and it's actually to the EU ambassador to the Republic of Colombia. We are discussing about principles, the principle of common concerns, CBDR, and the principle of cooperation. And the principle of cooperation is embedded in many agreements, the USCCC, etc. And it's also include the issue that the Professor Cotier mentioned, transfer of technology, right? Transfer of technology and capacity building and innovation. More or less related with intellectual property. I don't want to open the debate on intellectual property, but what is the EU doing in addition to giving finance to adaptation, mitigation, just in this idea of applying these international principles in practice? That's how developing country members are trying to achieve. Thank you very much.
James, do you want? No, is that okay?
Very last.
Really short, please.
Super short. The fundamental issue we are debating is that free trade requires harmonization or almost consolidated unified local regulations, but this is fundamentally at odds with environmental law, because we have this common and but differentiated responsibilities, principles, and different impacts on the environment for each jurisdiction. So the only possible answer is unilateral measures. If I want to protect my domestic industry, I want to accompany that with unilateral measures to adjust and avoid the leakage. But this has the downfall of deepening the crisis of the multilateral trade system, and also does not yield positive environmental results, but because you will increase the trade of dirty products between dirty jurisdictions. So besides unilateral measures, what can we do? That's the question.
Can I start answering?
So
1 minute each.
I cannot respond to 4 questions in 1 minute.
Well, you continue. Well, it's 10 past. Marcus is about to kill
So
me.
I don't
so 1
agree
minute each.
with you that trade is about harmonization. You have mutual recognition. And I think that's the challenge. It's to compare. What we need is less lawyers, more environmentalists. And what we need is collaboration between states maybe, but I would say IGO. I'm doing a research about IGO initiative and how in times of crisis, many of the actions came from international organizations that decided to respond to needs that did not even exist when they were created. And for instance, in the late 80s, the World Bank realized environment is important. How am I going to deal with integrating environment in my opinions? Well, they're rich. They hired, I think, 83 environmental experts. They put them in each department. It shifted the movement. So as to whether leakage is or not a good politics or policy or goal, the environmentalists claim it is. Maybe it's not in this case, maybe it should be debated, but instead of looking only at lawyers from international economic law, although they're good, I would double the number of environmentalists to avoid having to, or to favor mutual recognition and comparison. That's the challenge.
Thank you, Gabrielle, for keeping. 1 minute.
I'll try to sum it all up. I do think there's two really key trends, and then three things that really have to happen. To me, the key trends that we're seeing in all of this is that we are moving away from some of the sort of rules, et cetera, approach to very much a standards-based approach. And within that is the second key trend, which is in the climate change space. I think you're going to see these standards have to be done on a sectoral basis. In other words, you're not going to see the same standard that works for steel, that works for plastics, that works for something else. So I think you're going to start to see all of these standards being broken down on a sectoral basis, which again, to some degree allows you to take on board some of the differences within the locale in which those sectors operate. But I think those are the key sort of trends. On the climate change side, I mean, I think Thomas has said it, but the absolutes are that we have to speed up. I mean, we simply cannot solve the climate change problem unless we marry trade tools to the climate change agenda. And where the marrying has to occur is on the movement of money, finance, on the movement of technology transfer, and on the movement of human capital. We have to use trade tools to do that. And I think there are a lot of ways in which we can use trade tools to do that. It could be something as basic as, give countries that agree to accept climate migrants under Mode 4 of GATS, give them credit under their NDCs. I mean, you could think of lots of other ways in which you could link countries opening up their GATS commitments to permit, again, services to come in on renewable energy in exchange for unequivocal commitments to actually transfer the technology, to actually provide human capital, so that when that solar plant is up and running, it is locally owned, locally run, and you have local engineers that now can spread that solar technology everywhere else in the country. So again, to me, those are the keys. Using the trade tools that we have to do those things will move the needle farther and faster.
Thank you, Jen. Ambassador Bertrand.
No, just maybe on the more specific questions that were directed to the EU and how we see the whole issue of cooperation, and particularly technology cooperation. This is the direction in which we want to go. I can give you a few, at least two examples of there's one, of course, which is our large research program, Horizon Europe, which is open to basically all our key partners, and where we basically try to bring in the research communities from a number of non-EU countries on board to basically design innovation together. But I can give you an even better example, which is we have a small program called Low Carbon Business Action that basically is a sort of matchmaking agency between Latin American and European companies looking for technological solutions, green technological solutions, and basically trying to make sure that the innovation circulates much faster, because they can build alliances, and most of them at the level of small and medium enterprises. These are two examples, but there's actually quite a few. And this is one of the topics that will be up for discussion in the EU CELAC summit that we will have on Monday and Tuesday, precisely how we can make sure that the relationship and the economic and green relationship between Latin America and Europe can become a relationship where you get more of the innovation, more of the technology, more of the production as well, based in Latin America and not in Europe. If you look back to our trade, I can take Colombia as an example. 10 years ago, our trade with Colombia, more than half was basically fossil fuels, basically carbon and coal and mostly. Now, half of it is agricultural products. And for us, in 10 years' time, the objective is that you have manufactured products and that you can actually get as much of the innovation and the technology here and then exporting to Europe as opposed to exporting raw materials.
Yep. I'm actually quite confident that based upon existing WTO disciplines and principles, we are able to adjust the system. I'll give you just one example. We have an obligation in Article 66(2) to provide incentives for technology transfer to least developed countries. I was looking into the possibility of using tax breaks to create these incentives. And I think there's a good case to do that. But we would need to revise the SES agreement with its strict provision and export subsidies. And this is the kind of work we should take up and move the thing forward.
Thank you very much. So it's 12:15, so we finished right on time considering we started 15 minutes late. Before freeing everyone for lunch, can I please ask you to join me in a big round of applause for such an engaging discussion? Thank you.
Hello, yes, 3 announcements. One, lunch is just right outside here, so we don't have to walk too much. And that second will let us to be here at 1 o'clock, which is when we are going to start. And thirdly, as you have seen, this is an open university. We don't have doors for people to people that cannot come in. So just keep your things by your side, because sometimes people from the district comes and take your baggage when you are distracted. Sorry to tell you this, but this is just like that. Okay, thank you.
We're glad to have you here in Universidad Externado de Colombia. Let me introduce you to the university's chancellor, Dr. Hernando Parra Nieto.
Thank you very much and good afternoon for everyone. As a president of the Externado de Colombia University and a member of the organizing committee of this 8th international conference, along with the Universidad del Rosario, I extend a warm greeting to all present here, including members of diplomatic bodies, members of the International Economic Law Society, professors, and students on this second day of this important event. As a spokesperson for the Externado community that I represent and my own behalf also, I would like to extend a warm and fraternal welcome to this institution, which received you with great joy and pleasure. This Externado, University Externado de Colombia, the venue for this important conference, stands as one of the most prestigious and reputable education institutions, national and international. These institutions of higher learning was built on the principles that characterize the liberal and radical ideas, which have served as a pillar of our identity. As a result of this knowledge and education, it's important to mention that the Department of Economic Law of our university was created in 1990 as an innovative space dedicated to the study and research of concrete solutions in the field of competition and consumer law, public services, banking, financial, and stock market regulation, and also in economic analysis of law, all which directly impact the quality of the human life. Today, this department has contributed in historic manner to the selection of our country, of our capital as a venue for this memorable occasion by the International Economic Law Society. Also, I would like to extend a special invitation to all of you to explore our open campus with beautiful flowers and trees and no walls. On this second day, Externado de Colombia University welcomes you with satisfaction. Please enjoy your stays in this, your home, Externado. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chancellor. Now, we're going to continue with our session, Introduction to Keynote Lecture, with Pinar Artidan, and Keynote Lecture, The Color of Sovereign Debt, with Professor James Gatti.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear members of the CIEL community and the distinguished representatives of the Universidad del Rosario and Externado de Colombia. We are very lucky to be here, and I'm very much grateful to both of the organizers of the CIEL committee for including me into the program and having the unique opportunity to actually introduce the keynote remarks of Professor Gatti. What I will do is actually, I will just try to first introduce Professor Gatti, who obviously needs no extensive introduction, but then I will also try to perhaps give a couple of quotations from his book that he edited lastly, and he's going to talk about today, and a couple of recent works that he has worked previously on, mainly the Global South issues, the inequalities in the society, including, of course, in international economic law. And I think coming from a developing country, being a WTO shareholder representing Istanbul Big University, I think it has been a great decision. So I'm again grateful to the CIEL organizers and the executive committee for choosing me as one academic who is representing a developing country and introducing a professor who is very well versed into the issues on the problems related to global South and North issues. I would like to first begin by a short CV of Professor Gatti. Professor Gatti is a professor of law and Wing Tatley Chair in International Law at Loyola University Chicago School of Law. A graduate of the University of Nairobi, Kenya, and Harvard Law School, Professor Gatti sits on the board of editors of the American Journal of International Law, the Journal of African Law, and the Journal of International Trade Law and Policy, and on the advisory board of the International Journal of Constitutional Law, among others. He is also a founding editor of Afronomics Law, a blog on international economic law issues as they relate to Africa, and the Global South and the African Journal of International Economic Law.
His research and teaching interests lie in public international law, international trade law, third world approaches to international law, which is in short TWAIL, comparative constitutionalism and human rights, as well as business law. He is an independent expert on the working group on extractive industries, environment, and human rights violations in Africa, formed by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. He is also an expert member of the working group on agricultural land investment contracts of the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law, which is in short, as we know, UNIDROIT. He has sat as an arbitrator in international commercial arbitrations hosted by the Permanent Court of Arbitration. He's an elected member of the International Academy of International Law. He has consulted for the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCR, and the Economic Commission for Africa, ICA, among others. He is widely published in the areas of public international law, international trade law, international human rights, and speaks extensively on these topics both in the United States and abroad. Professor Gatti's lecture today pertains to his latest work on how to reform the global debt and financial architecture. The book edited by Professor Gatti contains 12 chapters that advocate for overhauling the current ad hoc restructuring process, which, according to Professor Gatti, is dominated by the former colonial powers and which again only minimally represents the interests of the African countries. Let me borrow a quote from Professor Gatti's introductory remarks to the book to further illustrate the approach that this book and the contributing authors generally take. This book brings together African voices on reforming the global debt and financial architecture convened by the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. The global debt and financial architecture is a colonial legacy established when the most debt vulnerable countries in Asia and Africa were not at the table. Africa's 55 countries are therefore underrepresented in the governance structures of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, where they have a meager 6.1% of the voting rights. The IMF sits at the helm of the global debt and financial architecture. Its governance system, established by its Articles of Agreement, is based on weighted voting. Professor Gatti and the other contributors in the book take the view that when the votes of the permanent members of the Paris Club are added to the weight shares of major countries of the IMF, it is quite clear that the poorest economies of the world have no influence at the IMF. Since the approval of Paris Club members is necessary before the commencement of any renegotiation of a sovereign debt, the subordination of indebted countries is etched into the architecture of the global debt and financial architecture. Since Professor Gatti will provide us with an in-depth analysis of his approach in this book together with the contributors, I would like to conclude by borrowing yet another quote from his work together with Sergio Putti, where the authors argue, and I quote from their article together, "The disenchantment with the current international economic order is real and is not new. The problems lie deep. We need an inclusive and legitimate way to eliminate the inequities built within the global economic order. Resolving these structural issues will require unprecedented reforms that make international economic law more equitable and democratic and address its racist origins. For that reason, we depart from the proposal in David Sloss's introduction to this book to the extent it is predicated on preserving a rules-based international order that is consistent with liberal democratic values. We propose instead a deeper engagement with the legacies of colonial dispossession and post-colonial exploitation of the global South that lie at the heart of the current global economic order. That deeper engagement can provide a foundation for a more profound and progressive transformation of international economic law." With this, I will conclude my introductory remarks. I will give the floor to Professor Gatti, but I would like to say that, of course, I will be mindful of the time, and Professor Gatti kindly accepted to take the Q&A time at the end. I hope that we will have enough time to receive your questions and entertained by Professor Gatti all the questions that you may have in this very challenging topic. Professor Gatti, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pinar, for that very kind introduction. And I'm really delighted to be here. It's a true honor to have been invited by CL to give these remarks. It's very hard to say no to my friend, Wezi. This is a true honor. It's also great to be at a university in the Global South. It's a beautiful campus. I walked up, and it's a really magnificent facility. I also want to thank CL for the support of the African Network on International Economic Law. Its support has been indispensable and very valued. And I hope that we can continue working together. And the last sort of introductory thing I wanted to say is that my thinking on what I'm going to talk about today has been influenced by a group of researchers we've been working together with, the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network. I see Professor Akinkube is there. I wonder which version of Akinkube is in this room, because I know there are more than one of him. It's been wonderful collaborating with this group of researchers who, as Dr. Pinar said, wrote all the chapters. I just wrote the introduction to that book that she just mentioned. Today I want to think aloud about sovereign debt distress. I'll be about 40 minutes or less, maybe even less than that. So I want to think about this era of sovereign debt distress with a historical lens. I thought what approaches to international law person. So history is central to everything that I do. And I do so without assuming, as you already had, that existing institutional and disciplinary solutions provide a way out of this distress. Overwhelmingly, sovereign indebtedness in the Global South is traced to basically what the World Bank says. Let me just read from the World Bank. It's a symptom of deeper structural and institutional weaknesses in developing country economies. It's sort of the typical story about how indebtedness was created, mostly sort of going back to excessive borrowing, especially after the OPEC oil crisis, with lots of petrodollars going around the world, and stories like the fact that the absolute theory of sovereign immunity disappeared, increasing capital flows and all that. So I want to set that story aside today. Instead, I want to demonstrate two things, given my larger historical context in talking about the financial subordination of indebted countries. So that's the first claim. You know, we have to go back to a little history, and I will sort of spend quite some time today doing that. Secondly, this lecture also makes another equally important claim. That is that structures of economic domination, such as those of financial subordination, are inseparably connected to ratio domination. There's simply no way to understand finance capital without its deep and abiding connections with race. So I will, in this lecture, proceed as follows. In the first part of the lecture, I will trace the use of financial supervisory mechanisms by public and private creditors from Europe and the United States of indebted countries like Bulgaria, Macedonia, and other countries in the Balkans that were regarded as the Congo of Europe. So emphasis on the Congo of Europe. So this historical period for both this example and the next one is late 19th century and early 20th century. The second part of the lecture will focus on Liberia. In doing so, I hope to retell how the world's second Black republic experienced financial subordination that came with the types of financial supervisory mechanisms imported from the US's experience in Central America. I will devote some time to also discuss Liberia's very famous 1926 loan. I don't know how many people know about this loan. This was a loan that was borrowed to facilitate Firestone's investment in Liberia's rubber plantations in that country. And in doing so, I'll devote some time to a debate between W.E. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, who wrote contemporaneously about the loan controversy. So they were writing in real time. So I'm not citing people who sort of thought about it later on. In fact, W.E. Du Bois had been hired by the US government to go and help Liberia, the first Black Republic, to negotiate this loan, among many other things. So before finalizing the lecture, and if there's time, I also want to say a little bit, borrowing from a great book by Peter James Hudson, how Bankers and Empire, how Wall Street colonized the Caribbean. Okay, so in this first part of the lecture, I want to focus on these financial supervisory mechanisms that were used in the late 19th and early 20th century to discipline and to plunder. And one of the basic takeaways from this historical period is that the kinds of extensive encroachments on the financial sovereignty of today's most indebted economies are far from new or novel. Jamie Martin's recent book, The Meddlers: Sovereignty, Empire, and the Birth of Global Economic Governance, discusses a series of examples of such extensive encroachments in Europe in the early part of the 20th century. His book discusses how the indebtedness of Central and Eastern European as well as Balkan states in that period involved an extensive legacy of external control over their assets and budgets in exchange for loans. Although the League of Nations was established with limited authority over economies of its members, it established an economic committee to oversee the implementation of its ambiguous mandate to ensure equitable treatment of commerce. That's all the League mandates say, to ensure equitable treatment of commerce among its members. But subsequently, the League Financial Committee developed powers to reach into the domestic economic realms of select member states. Jamie Martin refers to the emergence of the League's powers to reach into the domestic policies of some of the members as a truly radical innovation. This is true, but as I will show in this lecture, the financial subordination of indebted countries by interests of global capital predate the League period. What is clear, though, and I'm in entire agreement with Jamie Martin, is that the League of Nations Financial Committee was given an inch and it took a whole mile and more. The League of Nations justified those powers on account of the fact that financial stability more so than any issues of trade poses a strategic liability to some of the League of Nations most powerful countries. Heavily indebted countries during the League of Nations period were regarded as failed states. This in turn justified the League assuming as one of its past tasks to oversee financial stabilization by giving financial stabilization loans to these failed states. These are all these are not my words. These are the words used by officials of the League of Nations in this period. And I hope they're ringing true to you because these are terms that are still used today in the context of sovereign debt and many other issues. These loans were accompanied by strict conditions and external control over borrowers' domestic policies concerning currency, imports, exports, taxation, everything. The League of Nations conditional loans in this period were therefore a prelude to today's practices of conditional lending. Some of the countries receiving these loans were regarded as sort of the weaker European countries, which in turn meant that were subjected to these strict foreign economic controls. A strategy of the League of Nations financial reconstruction interventions was to insulate officials of the League from domestic opposition as budgets were cut and civil servants dismissed. As international economic lawyers, we're very familiar with this story of insulating international institutions from domestic politics. If you think about the Bretton Woods institutions, they have non-political clauses in their constitutive agreements on the non-political mandate. It's a classic thing that started long before the Bretton Woods institutions. So I want to focus on Bulgaria, and I do so quite intentionally. In the 1880s, the then newly independent Bulgaria was heavily indebted to creditors from Britain, Australia, and Germany. Prior to its independence as part of the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria had experience dealing with external creditors. For example, prior to its independence from the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria was on the hook for repayments when the Ottoman government defaulted on its external debts in 1875. When the Ottoman government agreed to settle these debts through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration established in 1881, the agreement allowed that OPDA, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, an entirely private body of primarily European bondholders, to take control of the Ottoman Empire's revenue, including tobacco, stamp, salt revenues, customs duties, revenues of patents, as well as the contributions of areas formerly under Ottoman control, such as Bulgaria. The Ottoman government had only one representative in the OPDA, and that representative's voice was limited to merely having a consultative voice. What the OPDA experience shows, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration shows, is how creditors seek to ensure indebted sovereigns have prime revenues as a reliable and regular type of insurance in the event of default. And I'm going back to this history in part because everything that I found going back to this history is everything that we've been working on as the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network. We have these things on our website, on our blog, Economics Law, where we monitor what's happening with the debt situation of various African countries. And I can tell you, it's history basically repeating itself. All these stories are not stories of yesterday. These are stories that are happening contemporaneously as we speak. I mean, of course, therefore, today that role is played by the International Monetary Fund that conditions debt on assurances that governments will raise enough revenue for debt repayments, and that they will cut public spending, among other things. Further, like today's indebted sovereigns, the Ottoman government was using new loans to pay outstanding loans. Further, European creditors were willing to continue lending the Ottoman Empire, even when it was heavily indebted, thereby trapping the Ottoman Empire into a vicious cycle of debt. And it reminds me of work like Susan George's work about how the global debt and financial system resembles a casino, but I digress. Let me go back to the OPDA. So the OPDA is regarded as an important prelude, not only to increased European capital flows to the Ottoman Empire, but also to European imperialism within Europe, or at least within the continent of Europe. This led me to think of how scholars such as Bhupinder Chimni have demonstrated very authoritatively how the development of rules of international law in the early 19th and 20th centuries was closely linked to the development of capitalism. For scholars like Chimni and Anthony Angi, the rise of rules of international law cannot be dissociated from how these rules were crafted to safeguard the interests of global capital through mechanisms of dispossession and exploitation, as well as to justify the imposition on financially weaker countries. So, and my emphasis here, it's not just European, non-European. Global capital did not make those boundaries, although it used, as I will show, racist discourse, or to be more specific, racialization, as I will call it. For 12 scholars, third-world approaches to international law, the growth of capitalism was closely related to the production of difference, as it was with enforcing sameness, standardization, and homogenization. Restated another way, a racialized standard of civilization has been a central component of the creation and subsequent maintenance of imperial economic and racial hierarchies in international law. In fact, some recent work persuasively argues that empires can be understood as machines for organizing debt and indebtedness. As my example from the Americas in about the same time period will show, towards the end of this lecture, the end of the 19th century was a period of increasing financial integration as lenders from Europe and North America entered into debt relations with countries that needed funds for needs such as infrastructure, industrialization, as well as consolidating the position of elites within these states. So I can say more about Bulgaria. I have many examples of what happened there. But my goal in discussing Bulgaria's experience with bondholders in the early part of the 20th century serves at least two purposes. First, to show how financial supervisory mechanisms, by both public and private credits from Europe and the United States were imposed over indebted countries in the periphery of the global economy. My point is not so much to trace the origins of these external controls over indebted countries, as I've said, but rather to indicate their pervasive use in the past. As I will demonstrate in my second example below, this Bulgarian example also helps to emphasize how foreign financial controls over non-European countries by creditors, Western creditors and countries, long predated, as I've already said, the League of Nations period. Second, and most importantly, really, I'm interested in exposing the role that race and identity played in understanding how indebtedness in countries like Bulgaria at the periphery of Europe was understood. As Bulgaria epically struggled with its indebtedness together with other Balkan states like Macedonia, it was referred to as the black sheep of Europe or the Congo of Europe. These references clearly showed how European elites, such as the British liberals of the period, were mobilizing images of backwardness and blackness to amplify how dangerous the indebtedness and ungovernability of Bulgaria, Macedonia, and other countries in the Balkans was. These European elites argued in favor of securing the stability and orderly governance of the Balkans. While British efforts in Africa were aimed at halting the slave trade, Macedonian peasants were often depicted as an enslaved population. While British liberals of the period felt it their duty to bring civilization and progress to the Congo and to stop the slave trade, they also wanted to bring self-governance to Macedonia and other Balkan states, which in their view needed rescuing from Islamic influence and Turkish rule. They were fiscally pretty racist, but not just racist because my talk is full of quotes, so a lot of these are quotes, but also because this is part of what I'm calling racialization, how racial difference is mobilized to justify the financial supervisory mechanisms. And I'm using Europe very intentionally because we Twi'lers are often blamed as sort of, focusing on North-South, European, non-European, but this is entirely within Europe. And of course, as we all know, Europe is certainly very diverse, just like Africa is. But I'm doing this very intentionally, very provocatively, hopefully. For these liberals, to quote someone else, the Balkans constituted an Oriental tyranny on the highways of European commerce and culture. Well, it's unwise to draw parallels between the designation of the Balkans as the Congo of Europe to the ways in which non-European countries were pathologized in colonial Orientalist discourses. It's important to reflect for a moment why the Balkans were thought as the Congo of Europe. And I can say a lot about that. But I'll pause here just for a second. And so it sort of reminds me a lot about the discussions Dr. Artiran about Turkey's desire to join the European Union, and no more need be said about that. And so just to push this point further, this racialization point, the use of terms such as the Congo of Europe or the black sheep of Europe is part and parcel of a racialization process reflected in lender-borrower relationships. The key point I want to draw, borrowing especially from Marxist scholars like Robert Knox and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, is how processes and discourses of racialization, as the ones I'm discussing here, together with supervisory mechanisms of indebted countries, impose disproportionate cost of participating in an increasingly monetized and profit-driven world on those who have been racialized. Key to this idea of racialization or production of tropes of risky borrowers, populations, and countries is seeing race not through a biological or cultural lens, or just as through the lens of interpersonal discrimination, but rather as an organizing principle of social stratification, extraction, and expropriation. So let me go to Liberia. So I really got very intrigued with the story about Liberia and Firestone going to invest in the rubber plantations there for a number of reasons, not least, so it's the sort of the commercial reasons that Firestone was going to Liberia. The Europeans were clamping down on rubber supply from their Asian plantations. Ford Motor Company was creating lots of cars, and Ford himself was banging the doors of the White House, trying to figure out where rubber supply would come from for the tires for these new cars. I mean, this is a really fascinating story. Those people at the very, very center of that period really had tough problems to resolve. But another reason I was very intrigued was when I realized that contemporaneously, as this was happening, the US government figured the best strategy is to hire W.E.B. Du Bois to go and negotiate on behalf of Firestone with the Americo-Liberians in Liberia. And I found that very fascinating. And what is really even more fascinating is that the early Du Bois, as I'll be saying in a minute, was very hopeful about what Firestone could do for Liberia. He was especially hopeful, and he really pushed on behalf of Firestone. He actually visited Liberia with the Firestone executives. And so this is a really wonderful story from my vantage point. Now, Cedric Robinson writes about the second Du Bois, the Du Bois that emerges in the 1930s, who becomes radicalized because his hopeful moment in the 20s dissipates very quickly by the 1930s, when he becomes super radicalized because everything that he'd hoped that Firestone would do for Liberia was falling apart. And so, just to quote from Robinson, he attributes the eventual awakening or consciousness of middle-class Black intellectuals like Du Bois to the crisis of capitalism experienced, especially in the Great Depression. According to Cedric Robinson, Du Bois's radicalization led him and a generation of Black radicals to their realization that their Black petite bourgeoisie classes political and historical vision was responsive to only one racial consciousness, white superiority. That's quoting directly from Cedric Robinson. So in short, Du Bois had in his initial support for Firestone failed to see that Liberia was, for all intents and purposes, a virtual protectorate of the United States. Liberia was very much like Cuba, Panama, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Haiti, which were all subject to numerous supervisory mechanisms and, of course, blockades in the period over their economies as a result of indebtedness to the United States, as well as their political dependence on the United States. So I want to, before ending, say a little more about Liberia and its experience with private creditors, because it parallels very much all the examples from Europe that I was talking about a minute ago. And the United States preferred the Liberia to remain an independent Black republic and intentionally refused to make it a protectorate, even though the Europeans were like, but this is what you control everything there. Why are you pretending that it's not a protectorate? Just name it. But the United States refused. And there's another second reason, as you'll know in a minute, why I think Liberia is an important example in the context of the remarks that I am making. So the United States was, of course, working with American bankers. They appointed a customs receivership in Liberia that also functioned as a financial advisor, together with auditors from the United States who were responsible for making periodic reports and inspections. And this is very similar to also what happens, as I just said, in places like the Dominican Republic, where the United States had established customs receipts to be paid to a US receiver under the Roosevelt Corollary, effectively having fiscal control over the Dominican Republic, including on the collection and distribution of its customs revenue while reserving the right of military intervention if they didn't pay. And as Robert Knox also says in the context of Haiti, even raiding the central bank, the gold in the central bank, using armed force. This model of dollar diplomacy involved establishing loan receivership agreements that were extended under President Taft's administration to Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and other countries. And so this I found really very fascinating parallels with what is happening today. And there are a number of agreements. I'll not go through all of them. I just want to focus briefly on the 1926 loan agreement that Liberia borrows to facilitate Firestone's rubber plantation. This was a $5 million loan that included supervision by a financial advisor who was responsible for collecting all of Liberia's revenue, and an auditor who gave prior approval to all expenditures. You know, I remember when I was a student at the University of Nairobi, somebody said to me, do you know that there's an IMF official who sits in the treasury in Nairobi? And I was like, how could that be possible? But it's true, you know, that the analogies of the period I'm talking about are playing out in real time around the world as we talk about the debt distress that many of these countries are facing. But before ending with a few concluding remarks, it would be incomplete. My discussion of Liberia would be incomplete without a discussion of another Black intellectual of the period, Marcus Garvey. So Marcus Garvey had his Back to Africa movement with Liberia as a key destination. And he disagreed with Du Bois's early preference for what he called white capital for Liberia's rubber plantations. Garvey, the leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, said, you know, my association is going to provide this loan. You know, why not take a loan from us? We're going to raise the money. And what is key to Marcus Garvey's views is that his views on multinational investors in agriculture were forged out of his own personal experience working for the United Fruit Company as an Afro-descendant immigrant in Costa Rica. Garvey traveled across Panama, right here, Colombia, and other Central American countries along the Caribbean coast, witnessing the ill treatment of Afro-descendant and other non-white workers by banana corporations. Garvey, unlike Du Bois, therefore had a personal experience of the exploitation of Black labor, and therefore about how racial inequalities were built into the white structures of capitalism, as he called them. This experience in turn informed his vision of the Return to Africa movement and the fact that he preferred to mobilize Black rather than white capital to fund Liberia's rubber plantations. From Garvey's perspective, Du Bois and Liberia had surrendered an independent Black state to the white capitalists of Firestone. Garvey offered, of course, to raise these funds. The Liberian elites rejected Garvey's proposal, arguing that it would drive out white people out of Africa at a time when many European economic interests were vying for a former foothold to extract wealth out of Africa. And this really proves one of Garvey's insights about how white capital snared local elites who then acted against the interests of their own people. Garvey's critique of white supremacy, and in particular its economic domination over Black peoples, was concerned with racial emancipation and equality. Garveyism linked racial domination in the United States to imperial rule in Africa and the Caribbean. And as I already mentioned, Du Bois did ultimately revise his initial optimism. The 1930s Du Bois was a much different Du Bois, who then began to see the segregated workforce of white management and Black labor that was no different from other extractive industries that the European colonization of Africa had built. So let me conclude with some thoughts about the implications of the examples I've outlined above. First, I want to emphasize how race, or more precisely what I've called racialization, justified in Firestone's investment in Liberia. This racialization is a key part of how the loan transactions and financial supervisory powers were designed. In Liberia, Firestone invoked images of lawlessness and chaos in ways that justified the use of the American state to pretend over the Liberians, especially the indigenous Liberians, whose political, economic, and social practices were seen as inferior and in need of civilization. Yet from my examples, racialization was not restricted to Liberia. It was projected through the racist idea of the Congo of Europe to Bulgaria, Macedonia, and other parts of geographic Europe. In the Liberian context, these discourses of inferiority formalized racially coded and unequal relationships between white capital and the United States on the one hand, and Liberians on the other. These unequal relationships were also built on the presumptions that the financial supervisory powers and rules that came with the loans from white capital were a superior antidote to debt-distressed or backward economies. The economic advantage of the United States and its investors like Firestone were therefore based on a teleology that frames the economic advantage as resting on its presumed superior intellectual, political, economic, and social practices. Finally, on this point, my examples demonstrated that this teleology was not restricted along a black-white paradigm, as my example from the Balkans and the former Ottoman Empire showed. This racialization is a pervasive feature that invariably accompanies the extractive and subordinating logics of sovereign debt wherever they occur. Second, as my examples in this lecture have hopefully demonstrated, if you're still awake, busy, these accounts of the superiority and inevitability of Western ideas about what constitutes good economic governance are built on the erasure of the violent history of European imperialism, of conquest, of slavery, of genocide, land and resource expropriation, and the trope of civilization that claimed that, of course, the West was superior and the rest were inferior. Third and finally, as international economic lawyers, we have to look beyond the many layers of the technical and doctrinal sophistications and the accompanying mystifications if we are to fully lay bare the basic issues and stakes involved in sovereign debt. By demystifying the doctrinal policy and technical underpinnings of sovereign debt contracts, indentures, and other complex debt instruments, and I'm very interested in that, we can begin to appreciate how these instruments embed and are embedded in histories and institutions that subordinated some at the expense of others, including along axes such as, but not limited to race, class, and gender. And just to emphasize this point by invoking yet another of my inspirations, I follow and agree with Christopher Gibbers when he argues that we have to do more to examine how structures of racial and economic domination are not only connected, but how they are inextricably linked and inseparable. So both historically and theoretically, more work in my view needs to be done, drawing links between structures and histories of racial domination on the one hand, and those of economic domination, such as the mechanisms of financial subordination I've discussed. And in a recent volume that I saw Captain Thousand here, that the Journal of International Economic Law invited us with Nina Suvala. We edited a volume on racial capitalism and international economic law. And that's not even a drop in the ocean. Much more needs to be done. And perhaps we need to collaborate with political economists like Ilyas Alami, who are doing really fantastic work on this question about the mobilization of racialized difference and coloniality in the context of financial subordination. And asking these types of questions, in my view, opens up new and important types of questions that we often don't ask. For example, why should indebtedness be understood only or merely from a contractual perspective or framework? What about the climate debt owed to developing countries that are suffering the brunt of the damage caused, especially by especially large contributions to the climate crisis by developed countries? What about reparations for historical injustices such as slavery and colonialism? Why aren't we asking those questions? They matter. I don't think that the contract is the only way to think about debt. There are more ways to think about debt than the contract. So we as international economic lawyers have to do more of this kind of probing, because doing so, in my view, is a key precondition, not merely for alternative or subaltern points of view, like 12, but for a more just, inclusive, and equitable international economic order. And if these reasons don't convince you, since maybe like me, you do a lot of trade or international investment law, you might want to remember that by far, debt is the most important source of wealth creation and of course oppression, than perhaps global trade in monetary and value terms. So many thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
I don't know whether this is working. I hope it's working. Well, thank you very much, Professor Gatti. I mean, this was truly impressive, especially again, you know, coming from Turkey, but my past is Ottoman Empire. I had no idea that Ottoman Empire had such practices. So it was eye-opening. So very much interesting. I would like to now open the floor for questions. We have 15 minutes. And yeah, I see hands. I see first Professor Gao. And then perhaps, yes, over there. And I see Leyla Şükrün. And over there. Okay. So we have 15 minutes. I'll take care of the time. Please go ahead.
Thank you, James, for the tour de force, which took us through all these difficult periods in history. Now, just in response to your quote about the Congo of Europe, I think you might be delighted to know that the UK nowadays aspires to be the Singapore on tents, you know. So hope that gives you some comfort. But a more serious question is regarding China. You know, since China is now providing so much financial assistance to the developing world, I wonder whether you could discuss, you know, how the Chinese rules are different from the old rules set by Europe and US, and how this is going to change international economic law. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gatti. Of course, Frantz Fanon reminds you about how we people from the third world still defend the ideas of the global north. And just to say that it doesn't matter that people from the global south are in these international bodies. My question is the following. We had a few weeks ago the 10th conference in Paris about international debt. At the end, there was no agreement. Some countries like us are saying, why don't you forgive part of the debt and then we won't proceed to exploit minerals and of course oil. So I would like to know your thoughts about this conference in Paris and the proposals from global south countries like Colombia. Thank you.
I will also echo what others have said, James, and what a tour de force. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. So I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more, if you would, about the public and the private dimensions here. You mentioned that both public creditors and private creditors are involved in this scheme, so to speak. And yet we're seeing, of course, more push for sort of ESG on the private side. At the same time, though, there are calls for legislation to stop private lenders from blocking debt relief agreements. So it seems like there's a bit of a disconnect there, and welcome your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Gatti, for this fascinating presentation, which in a way counterbalances very nicely the sort of very politically correct discussion we've just had on climate change this morning, in which most of the global south was ignored. It's also very relevant because you may have seen yesterday the UN Secretary General tweeted about sovereign debt and said that more than 3 billion people are living in countries which pay more to refund the debt than they give to education or health, for instance. So my question, and I'm building upon what Catherine just said, my question has to do with cooperation. So how can we talk about climate change? How can we talk about debts when we know actually the sort of elephant in the room, cooperation? So what sort of, role and how would you integrate private entities and indeed cooperation into this picture?
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so let me just begin by saying I don't have all the answers. I'm very good at asking questions. I'm not very good at answering questions. About China, I know there's been a bit, Professor Gao, as you know, whether China is lending differently. Let me just say two quick things about it. First, I think there's been some suggestion that China lends opaquely. But I don't think that is true, because almost all external loans, I'm trying to phrase this very clearly, are written in contracts and indentures that are highly confidential, that are privy, whether it's for private creditors or bilateral lenders. These contracts are simply not available widely. So in that respect, I disagree with some of the stuff that's been going around suggesting that actually China's debt is much more opaque. Secondly, and I think, just to answer your question straight on, I think China is acting like all the other hegemons in the context of debt. And in fact, on contingent debt, hidden debt, this is where I think that, China may be behaving very differently than other lenders, because, for example, the lending to Angola on condition that Angola exports oil to China, those kind of resource exchange deals for debt, are some of the most untransparent. And in the book that Dr. Atran mentioned, there's a wonderful chapter about a particular project in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I mean, the book is freely available on economics law, discussing those types of deals. So I don't think China is behaving very differently. I think it's behaving just like all the other creditors in the history, in the brief history that I have told. That, they are lending, of course, much more for infrastructure, for example, than other things. But in my view, they are not very different. The other thing I wanted to say is in the context of some of the restructuring that's going on under the common framework, China has also been criticized for moving a little too slowly. But as we've just seen with the restructuring with respect to Zambia, it was the bilaterals, it was the Paris Club that moved faster than the private creditors. There's no private creditor deal with respect to Zambia. So this is just to say the picture is a little different. I think that China did very well under the DSSI, the debt suspension initiative that ended at the end of last year. And I think some people say it burnt its fingers and therefore it's moving slowly with these other restructurings. But I think China is not behaving any differently than any other creditors. Except the US certainly wants to play this up as part of the geopolitical game in Africa. And if you've been following our blog, we've been following step by step, the visits, for example, in Zambia, the same week, the head of the IMF, the Treasury Secretary from the United States, a big minister from China, so, the geopolitics is there. Now, the 10th conference on debt in Paris and proposals from Global South countries. As I came to Bogota, we are editing a volume on climate finance and debt from a Global South perspective with African scholars, with young African scholars. It's going to be released on the sidelines of the meeting, the climate meeting in Nairobi in September. So look out for that. We're going to make it freely available. The chapters are wonderful by young researchers, not taking any assumptions about many of the green deals we're hearing and things like that. So watch out for that. It's going to make, in my view, a contribution to the discussion from at least our part of the Global South. In relation to this question about, proposals for solutions, we often don't hear much about debt cancellation, for example, and this goes to Kathleen's point. But when the big countries want debt cancellation, it happens. Let me give you two quick examples. One, after the US illegally invaded Iraq, the US sent former Secretary of State Baker to negotiate a deal to cancel all of Iraq's debt. And the very day that the entire debt was canceled by a resolution of the Security Council, the United States president at the time issued an executive order barring any enforcement action against any Iraqi assets in the United States arising as a result of the cancellation of that debt. That's one example. Another example is after Germany's defeat in the Second World War, in 1953, the London Debt Agreement effectively forgave all of Germany's debt. And some people argue this is exactly why Germany was able to recover as quickly as it was to become the industrial power that that it is today. So when the world wants to do, the big countries want to do this, they do it, but they don't want to cancel debt for the most climate vulnerable poor countries who, as we had, they're spending, an enormous amount of their monthly budget to pay external debt. A few weeks ago, the Kenyan government did not have money to pay their civil servants because of the amount of external debt they had to pay. Right now in Nairobi, there are protests going on as I speak, arising out of, like there was in Colombia not too long ago, as a result of the amount of money that is being spent on servicing private debt. On the public-private, and I'll say something also about the Kathleen question about the public-private. As I was reading all this stuff from especially the period of late 19th century and early 20th century, and I've been reading this for other projects that I've been researching on, it strikes me that the arguments we make, at least in the United States, about the government being separate from private capital are entirely mistaken. They're entirely mistaken. The US government is centrally, the US Treasury has been centrally involved for more than a century in the finance space in a way that undermines any argument that there's a public-private distinction. And it's not just about dollar diplomacy of the period. Even to date, all the restructuring frameworks that are going on through the IMF, they have to meet the US's approval because the US has an absolute veto in the IMF. The US, and nothing can happen in the IMF without the US's approval because of the weighted voting system that Dr. Aturan read about. To make any change that is going to be substantive within the IMF, you require an 80% threshold vote. The US has the vote share, 85% is the threshold for any fundamental changes. The US has 17-point-something% of the voting share. So the US has an effective veto. Even this year when they discuss whether they're going to change the voting, the weighted voting formula, because, the economies like China that now have much more economic weight, it's not going to be possible because unless it meets the US's approval, it's not going to happen. So, another part of my research, as Dr. Aturan was saying, is sort of showing how the rules entrench this history. The rules centrally entrench this history that we are living at the moment. And there's just no way we can escape this history. And it's not just a history of the rules, it's a racist history. It's a very deeply racist history. And there's just simply no way to see it otherwise. And I challenge anyone to show me that it's not about race. It's not just about the rules, it's about race. Race is a central organizing feature of the global economic system. About private creditors, I can say more about private creditors. I spend a lot of time on the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network monitoring private creditors. Private creditors are very insulated. There's this group in Washington, DC, I forget the acronym right now. They're really very powerful. I mean, they're the ones that when they call the Treasury, the US Treasury, they pick up their calls. That's how all this debt restructuring stuff is happening behind the scenes. And I think that we have to talk transparently about the power of private capital. There's just no way to go around it, just simply no way. Sorry, I went on too long and I was ranting.
I think the chief would like to ask a question if you don't mind, and then we are out of time.
Okay, okay. I don't know if I can answer Keith's question.
I didn't know I was going to get the last word or the last question. But in effect, I wanted to say something about the issue of indebtedness, not just as a finance issue. So we had a discussion or a roundtable on industrial policy on the first day of the conference. And I didn't get an opportunity to get my question in at that point. But I spoke to Mark Wu afterwards, and I said to him, whereas a lot of the focus on the panel was on the WTO and the way in which WTO rules restrict industrial policy in developing countries, I indicated to Mark or suggested to him that if you look at the role of the IMF and the World Bank through the issue of managing debt, that those rules and regulations are far more restrictive on industrial policy in developing countries than the WTO. Often the WTO is put up as the boogeyman, but there are other institutions that play a critical role. And so when you have the closure of fiscal space, it means you have the closure of policy space. And in the emerging context of increased indebtedness in the post-COVID context, we're going to find it increasingly difficult for developing countries and least developed countries to respond to the climate action requirements because of indebtedness. And then also the closure of policy space in relation to that debt coming from the finance institution. So I just wanted to throw that out there to add to the debate. Thank you very much.
And I completely agree. Thank you.
This concludes the keynote lecture by Professor Gatti. Please join me in giving a applause. Thank you very much. It's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gatti. Now, we're going to have a break until 2:30. Then you could go to the sessions of your preference. The panels are What Future for Security Exceptions in room I-203, Geopolitics and Trade in room I-204, Reforming the Multilateral Trading System, Dispute Settlement and Negotiations in room I-405, and International Investment Law, Systemic Appraisals and Reform in room I-505. If you need any help, please contact the staff.